Hi, I'm Dr. Jessica Saxon. I teach composition and literature here at Craven Community College. I'm here today to talk to you guys about Star Wars. I hope you're ready for a bit of a rabbit hole with me. So, because I'm a literature teacher, I also got to give you guys a little bit of vocabulary today. And we're going to start with the idea of hypotext. Hypotext is a term that was developed by Gerard Genette, and it basically means a earlier text that becomes source material for a later text. So, any text can have a hypotext, anything that's before it that influences it, and any text can have multiple layers of influence as well. There doesn't just have to be a one-to-one ratio between the two of them. So Star Wars has got a ton of hypotext to it. It draws, of course, on cowboy and western movies. It draws on opera forms as well. Science fiction genres, especially Dune. There's a brief aside about accusations of plagiarism with Dune when the first trilogy came out. It draws on early pulp fiction from the about 1920s through 1940s, no, 40s through 50s. It goes even further back. It draws on ancient Greek plays like Oedipus Rex. In Oedipus Rex, one of the core tenets of that is the inescapability of fate and destiny. An oracle has told you that you will become this thing, and try as you might to avoid that fate, you're always going to run headlong into it. Every decision you think that you are making to avoid that destiny becomes a step closer to that destiny. Drawing off of Oedipus complex and moving back into the 20th century, it also has connotations of the Oedipus complex, the Freudian idea of what's called a family romance, is what Freud termed it as. So in the original trilogy, that's going to be the Luke and Leia dynamic. In the later trilogies, it's the question mark about whether or not Rey and Kylo Ren are actually related to each other or not, whether there's going to be a repeat of that dynamic from the first trilogy. But the one I want to talk to you guys today is one that we don't talk about a whole lot, and that's the connection to fairy tales in the Star Wars universe, because it is absolutely a fairy tale, and it's one of the most interesting forms of fairy tale remixing that you can find too. So with Star Wars and fairy tales usually have a vague location. Once in a kingdom, in a galaxy somewhere, sorts of stuff. They also have very, very vague time periods, always set in the past, right? Once upon a time in a kingdom far, far away, or long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Same sort of thing. They typically deal with storylines involving royalty, family problems, especially sibling problems, and especially parent-child problems. There's a lot of poor deceased mothers that show up in fairy tales as well, and Star Wars has got a ton of those. There's magical helpers. There's happily ever afters at the end of each of these stories. Those sorts of patterns pop up a lot, and those are probably ones that you recognize pretty quickly. So fairy tales have specific structures and specific characters related to those structures. And that's what an actant is. An actant is a character type that appears in stories across a genre form, okay? And it's more than just being a character. It is an integral structural element of the narrative. The narrative cannot proceed without that specific character type embedded in it. An actant can be embodied by one or more characters, and then the reverse is also true. A character can serve more than one actant role, okay? So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship. Grammas bases, in part, his idea of actants off of Vladimir Prop's 7 structural elements of fairy tales in regards to character types, okay? So the 7 are the villain, pretty easy to define. That's the person, character, force that creates a struggle or a problem for our hero. So think about Darth Vader specifically in the first trilogy. There's the dispatcher. That's the person that starts the hero's quest. In the very first film, that's quite clearly Princess Leia, who sends out this message into the galaxy asking for help that prompts the following action. There's a helper, usually a magical being that assists the hero on their quest. And there's multiple helpers you can point to in the Star Wars universe, especially in that first trilogy. There's the prize, oftentimes also termed the princess, usually because it is actually a princess inside of fairy tales. Marriage with her is oftentimes thwarted by the villain. Marriage is also the common ending of a lot of fairy tales too. We've got the donor. This is the character that prepares the hero for the quest, usually gives the hero some sort of a magical object, and oftentimes tests the hero prior to sending them out. So in the original trilogy, think Obi-Wan, think about Yoda as well. The interesting thing when fairy tales cross over into sci-fi is that the difference between a magical assistant and a technologically advanced assistant is a really fine sort of thing, right? One person's science is another person's magic and vice versa, right? So The magical helper can also be a technological assistant. In the Star Wars universe, it also has overlays of religious assistance as well, like this mystical force power that you can tap into, and the monastic ideas of the Jedi as well. There's, of course, the hero. That's going to be our Luke Skywalker character. And then there's a false hero as well that is probably best illustrated by Han Solo in the original trilogy. Sometimes taking credit for the hero's actions, sometimes assisting the hero, sometimes being a bit of a nuisance and getting in the way of the hero. But these are what the actants do inside of the story. These are kind of the basic functions. And in the Star Wars universe, when we get to any one of the TV series, the films, anything else like that, is the way in which they continually remix these actants and fairy tale tropes to constantly reinvent a very old and very familiar story. So the play with actants, especially when we start looking at some of the more recent series and more recent films from the 21st century, so maybe not some of the ones from the 70s and 80s. This play with actant types and who operates in what role injects excitement and newness into a really old form of storytelling. So for example, think about the play with the idea of the princess being the hero in the most recent trilogy. So Leia, who had been this very much damsel in distress, especially in that very first movie, by the time that we get to the more recent trilogies, she's this amazingly powerful leader sort of figure, filling in the void that's been left by Luke Skywalker, able to use the Force in ways that were not forecasted in some of the earlier films as well. She's a general, she's a princess, and actually, even in the very first trilogy, she's perfectly capable of saving herself given the opportunity to do so. You can also think about the ways in which villainy has been recast, especially thinking about the Jedi in some of the more recent series of maybe they're not this absolute moral force for good in the galaxy. They might be a little bit more complicated than that. They might be slightly flawed. Some of their ideology might not be the best path forward for everybody. So that's one of the ways that the actants can be remixed a little bit for us. The actants and the genre markers also help you, the viewer, or you, the reader, if you're reading one of the novels, piece the narrative together. They provide foreshadowing, but they also provide red herrings as well. So you get hints that Leia is going to be the damsel in distress, kind of that classic fairy tale trope. But it's also a bit of a red herring because she's not necessarily always the damsel in distress. The person that you think is the villain is not always the villain. It consistently comes back to that Star Wars theme about the dark and the light are not always separate. There's darkness inside of the light, and there's light inside of the darkness. It's not a binary, it's this ever-shifting scale between these two poles. So actants do that, but so do these things called aptronyms. Anybody that's taken a class with me knows that aptronyms are one of my favorite things to talk about. We talk about them all the time in my literature classes. And an aptronym is simply when a character's name foreshadows or gives us some sort of information about the character's traits. So something about their name signals what their traits are. And some are pretty obvious. In fairy tales, think about things like Prince Charming or Belle. Those are aptronyms. The only important thing about Prince Charming is that he's a prince and he's charming. And anything else than that is kind of flat. Belle, she's beautiful. She's the beauty in the side of the Beauty and the Beast, and that's her most important characteristic. Her name signals that beauty for her. Skywalker is a good example from inside of the Star Wars universe as well. This man who will go on to walk through the galaxy as kind of this powerful figure. But other aptronyms are not quite as readily apparent. So the fun thing about aptronyms, and part of the fun of exploring a well-known work like Star Wars, is looking at possible name meanings. Now, of course, you don't have to understand what a name means in order to get those character traits, but kind of like peeling an onion, it gets you a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. It can reinforce some things that you thought you might know about a character, and it also might provide a new way of thinking about that character, seeing them in a slightly different light based off of what their name is. So let's take a look at a couple of them together. And we're going to talk, let's start at the shallow end of the pool. We're going to talk about the fairly straightforward ones. So Luke, of course, we've got his last name Skywalker, but his first name Luke means light-bearing or light-giving. And, well, he's the hero, so he's destined to bring light to the galaxy and to aid in the downfall, actually not just aid, lead in the downfall of the Empire. He's also literally light-giving with the lightsaber, right? His weaponry is light-giving as well. Ben, and that's Ben as in Han and Leia's son, means favored son as well, this prized thing. Sometimes especially in the Star Wars universe, this connotation of the prodigal son, the son that has gone astray and the family's consistently trying to get him back into the fold. Maybe also part of why he decides to abandon that name in favor of a name that he chooses for himself. So we also have Rey. Her name means king, and she's consistently in the trilogy foreshadowed as being like this powerful leading figure. It's also notable that she doesn't have a last name, at least not one that she really claims. She takes the Skywalker name, of course, at the very end, but she doesn't really have one of her own. And kings, of course, don't have or really need last names. They simply are who they are. It also makes her a really nice pairing for Leia when we get to her name in just a minute too. We've got Padme. Her name is symbolic of a lotus flower, and lotus flowers are these beautiful flowers that grow up out of like the muck and the dirt. Out of kind of awfulness comes this beautiful thing. And lotus flowers become symbolic of strength and rebirth as well. So when you overlay that name meaning on top of who she is in that middle set of the trilogies, it adds another layer to her character. So those are fairly straightforward. Some names have got these kind of complicated layers of linguistic roots. So the name comes from a couple of different linguistic traditions. Leia, her name has 3 different possible roots. One is weary, as in worn and tired. And of course, anybody whose planet has been blown up will be worn and tired. The trials and tribulations that she goes through before the first film even starts are unbearable, right? But it also has another linguistic root that means mistress, and mistress in the sense of a powerful female figure, which then nicely links up to some possible Latin roots that mean lioness, right? And specifically lioness, not lion, but lioness, this mighty female predator, hunter, leader, the carer for the rest of the pack, which again ties her kind of nicely to that relationship she develops with Rey later on. One of my favorites is Han's first name. Now, of course, we've got Solo, kind of on the nose of like this lone gunslinger coasting through the galaxy doing whatever he wants to, right? But his first name, one of the roots of it, means steep incline. And especially in the first 3 films, Han really does have a kind of sharp learning curve. He gets pulled into all of this adventure and fiasco, and now all of a sudden he's part of a rebellion, and he's got a very sharp learning curve. And he's oftentimes resistant to the things that he sees around him and resistant to participating in that. So he's got a sharp incline road ahead of him. It also has connotations, though, with words that mean of uncertain origin. And Han is a bit of a mysterious character, especially at the very beginning. We don't know a whole lot about who he is, aside from, like, again, that lone gunslinger sort of image that we have. But then my favorite is actually the third possible meaning of his name. Han also has connotations in Middle German of a rooster. With rooster, and especially with the way that term shows up, it's got all these connotations of cockiness, of being egotistical, of being the best, the brashest, the most boastful. And with the connotations of rooster, not just the egotistical part of things, but also physically attractive, like this suave ladies' man sort of thing. Now, of course, you can get all of that just by watching him, especially in the first 3 films. But then when you watch him strutting around the galaxy and you get like this rooster connotation of his name, it reinforces his character. It maybe even makes part of him a little bit more comical, if you like that reading of him too. In later versions of the Star Wars universe, there's this idea that Palpatine is kind of the force behind Anakin's creation, okay? That he has made this child somehow. And this comes out in a couple of things outside of the films mostly. And in one of those, in a 2014 novel, he's actually given a first name. It doesn't show up in the films, but it shows up in this novel. And his first name is Shiv, which is very closely related to the principal Hindu god Shiva. Especially in Western culture, this god has associations with death and destruction. So the 2 parents of Anakin Skywalker are potentially a god and a goddess, right? With all of kind of those overlays of how Anakin's got this unstoppable almighty power, but one that represents all of these positive things: wealth, good fortune, prosperity, happiness, and another that represents death and destruction, the tearing down of the old world in order to build the new world. And then the last one is my deepest of rabbit holes for you guys. We're going to talk about Anakin, and we're going to get a little weird. So brace yourself, and always feel free to disagree if I say something that you think just doesn't quite add up, because that's the fun of interpretation, is going out on limbs and testing ideas and seeing what makes sense. So let's talk about Anakin. Arguably the heart of the Star Wars universe, right? Basically everything centers around who he is and what he has done and the generational ripples that come out from him. So Anakin's name comes from a German last name, Anakin. That Anakin spelled with 2 N's at the beginning, not the one that we see in the film. But the German last name Anakin means child of Heinrich. Okay? And Heinrich, as a German name, has got kind of some root words in it. One is home and one is power. And when you start looking at Anakin, especially in that middle trilogy, right, those are the 2 things that he longs for the most. Home, but also power. And power oftentimes in a sense to save his home or to protect the people that he loves the most as well. So this child of home, child of power, child that is consumed with ideas about both home and power. So we've got Anakin, this German surname that means child of home and power, more or less. But remember that he oftentimes goes by Annie, especially to people that know and love him. And specifically in Western cultures, Annie is a feminine name. It is a name that's more associated with women than it is with men, typically, especially in the culture that produced Star Wars, right, our modern American culture. He's got this kind of push-pull with a masculine-sounding name and a feminine-sounding name, possibly foreshadowing the fraternal twin children he has, where he has Luke and Leia, and kind of the masculine and feminine being split into 2 separate beings. But the name Annie, in and of itself, has its own meaning. And it's one that's kind of devastating when you look at what happens to him in his transition to Darth Vader. Because the name Annie means great beauty, a beautiful person, both kind of physically, certainly, but maybe also some connotations about like just a good person. And at the end of that middle trilogy, when we see him transition into being Darth Vader, not only has his soul been destroyed, right, and his mind, but his body has been destroyed too in that final battle he has with Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's badly burned, he's lost limbs, he's unable to breathe. So this great beauty that has become the embodiment of evil and ugliness in this galaxy. So a bit of an ironic gap between what his friends called him and the person he turned out to be. So let's take Actants and Aptronyms back to fairy tales again, because that is where we started after we spun off a little bit. So keep in mind, fairy tales are some of the oldest narrative forms we have. We have been telling some forms of fairy tales for as long as 6,000 years. That takes us back to the Bronze Age. They're one of the earliest forms of narrative structures that we have record of. And we keep coming back to them across time and across culture, across continents, across civilizations and societies. We just return to these stories. We keep telling them and telling them and telling them. And every time that we tell them, we adapt them to fit our morals, our religious views, our cultures and societies, our political views, our desires, our hopes, our fears, how we think about good and evil. All of that gets recast every time that we retell a fairy tale. And so what Star Wars does is it works within this really long lineage of fairy tale stories and adapts those structures to create something new and exciting and interesting, fresh as well, that has these roots in very, very old and very, very familiar storytelling structures. So the fascinating thing about Star Wars is the way that it takes the fairy tale structures and remixes them constantly. A very long-term project, if you've got a lot of time on your hands this weekend, is to watch all of the trilogies together and look at the ways in which the ones that are produced in the 70s and 80s morph into something slightly different with the ones that are produced in the 90s versus the ones that have been produced in recent years. And we have this kind of shift from fairly moral certitude, right? There's a good side and a bad side, right? And you don't give in to the bad side, you only follow the light sorts of stuff. And there might be great sacrifice associated with that, but the light will always win. And that gets a little bit more muddied as our society transitions over the last 45 some years. And so now in the more recent trilogies, there's more gray area of can those that are evil be turned back to somebody that is good? And can those that are good be corrupted? And are they as good as they really seem like they are? So that's our little podcast rabbit hole of trying to figure out how on earth the Star Wars universe is connected to fairy tales. Go read some fairy tales, go watch some Star Wars films, see what connections you can make and where these rabbit holes take you.